The very first issue of What If came out in 1977, and I thought it'd be a bit of fun to travel back nearly 50 years ago and read that comic. The title of this issue was What If Spider-Man Joined the Fantastic Four? And if you know anything about your Spidey history, you know that not only would he later go on to join the Fantastic Four, but he'd be on the same version of that team as Hulk, Wolverine, and Ghost Rider starting in issue number 347 all the way back in 1991. Another time, much later, Parker would again join them when it was known as the Future Foundation, and at that point he sported a particularly snazzy black and white suit. But early on in Spider-Man's career, he actually had a really hard time finding any superhero teams to join. And in the official canon of the 616 universe, shortly after receiving his powers, Peter Parker realized that fighting crime didn't really pay that well, so he would need to find a way to make some money to support himself and Aunt May, since Uncle Ben had recently passed. He decided to try to impress the Fantastic Four and see if he could join their team. And of course, the best way to do that in Peter's mind was to break into the Baxter building and try to surprise the FF while they were resting. And of course, this plan didn't really go as planned. Spidey ended up fighting the Fantastic Four, and after trading a few punches with the Thing, he managed to explain that he was just trying to get a job with the team. Reed Richards and the gang had to explain to Peter that they were a non-profit organization, and they didn't actually have any money to hire new recruits. Now, Spider-Man had a pretty fragile ego at the time, so instead of accepting that at face value, he thought the Fantastic Four were just brushing him off instead. So Spidey leapt out of the window and never looked back. But what would have happened if the Fantastic Four would have let him join the squad? Well, that's what this very first issue of What If tries to answer. In this universe, when Spider-Man jumps out of the window, Sue Storm calls out to him, telling him to wait a minute. And instead of angrily swinging off to the Lower East Side, which is what Spidey originally did in the comics, he decides to turn around. The Fantastic Four thought about it and decided that there was actually some wiggle room in their budget, but they have to know what Spidey's true identity is first. At that point, Peter reluctantly removed his mask, and then kind of just talked down about himself, You have to remember at this time, Peter Parker was just another bullied high school student with really low self-esteem. Even with his incredible powers, he still thought he was a nobody. Now that Reed and the other team members knew who they were dealing with, they brought Spidey on, gave him his first paycheck, and scheduled a press conference to announce their new member. And this was the moment that really changed everything for him. In every What If comic, there's a turn that fundamentally changes the fabric of a hero's life. Everyone knows that Spider-Man is a great hero who fights crime, even though the city of New York thinks he's a menace. That's one of the most important aspects of his journey. But thanks to this press conference, everything was about to change for the better, at least for Spidey. We'll see later how this actually ended up destroying Reed Richards' marriage, but we'll get to that in due time. Now, in the audience of the press conference, J. Jonah Jameson absolutely exploded when he saw that Spidey was joining the team. In front of a hall of reporters, he shouted at Reed Richards, demanding to know what he was trying to do by putting a known criminal on the roster, especially since Jameson had publicly accused Spider-Man of sabotaging his son's recent spaceflight. Now, Richards calmly explained that it was only the Bugle that was accusing Spidey, and in fact, Richards personally contacted his friends at NASA to drop all potential charges against Spider-Man. Jameson was confident enough that he could convince the world Spidey was a criminal, but he didn't have the stature to take on Reed Richards. Knowing that the best way to keep the Bugle relevant was to stay on the right side of history, Jameson took advantage of the moment to climb onto the stage and officially endorse Spidey as a member of the Fantastic Four. Which, if you think about it, was pretty evil and genius. Genius, well, because what else could he do in that situation? Jameson's reputation was higher than Spidey, but would be absolutely destroyed if he tried to take on the FF. So, as the old saying goes, if you can't beat him, then, join him. But it's also pretty evil because Jameson had been ruining a 16-year-old high schooler's life just to push his dime rag newspaper, and in this moment, you could see that there wasn't even an ounce of truth to any of it. If Parker were a lesser man, he would have driven his spider buggy off of a cliff, just to get away from all of that torment Jameson kept pouring out. But thankfully, he didn't. Now, after the press conference, the new team, now called the Fantastic Five, went on to face both traditional Spidey and Fantastic Four villains. This time they handled both with ease. Thanks to the Fantastic Four and the Human Torch's flight in particular, they were able to handle the Vulture in no time at all. And later, when the Fantastic Four's villain Red Ghost appeared, Spidey helped fight off the superpowered apes under Ghost's control. It wasn't soon after Spidey joined the team that Namor, the Submariner, showed up. Under control of the Puppet Master, Namor kidnapped Sue Storm and invited the other members of the Fantastic Five to fight him in his underwater kingdom. After basically beating up the entire team, a feat which makes him one of the most awesome villains in the Marvel Universe, mind you, Namor realized that he's not actually acting on his own. Something or someone was compelling him to fight. Now, at about the same time, the Thing threw a giant octopus into the Puppet Master's nearby submarine, which disrupted the villain's hold over everyone and released Namor from his control. But even though Namor was no longer under the Puppet Master's control, he was willing to go a few more rounds with Reed Richards in order to win over Sue Storm. But here's where another big change happens. We already know this issue of What If made Spider-Man's life infinitely better by transforming his public image from a low-level criminal into a well-respected superhero. Well, here, What If has to level off the balance of karma, and since it made Peter Parker's life so much better, it needed to make somebody else's worse. And in this case, that person was Reed Richards. Sue Storm only briefly debated who she would choose, and she actually quickly decided on Namor. You have to ask yourself why. Why did she leave? Because the Fantastic Four and her relationship with Reed Richards himself is one of the classic parts of the Marvel Universe. So how could she so easily leave all that behind? And the answer was pretty simple. It was because the team no longer paid attention to her now that Spidey had joined. Susan Storm was so committed to leaving that she even allowed Namor to transform her into an Atlantean, which meant she could breathe underwater but never could survive on land again.